Hello, friends, and welcome back to Reiki Women Podcast. My name is Michaela. I am with Heartscapes Reiki, and here with me today, as always, is Bronwen Logan of the International House of Reiki and Carrie Varela of the Reiki Healing Society. And in this ongoing conversation that the three of us have been dancing through, tumbling through at times, we are feeling like working with a subject today that if we're going to be talking about Reiki women and the lives of Reiki women and the lives of the people that we're in relationship with, this is a topic that inevitably needs to be looked at. And it's one that is really with all of us at one point or another in our lives. And yet we often find that there aren't spaces that are spacious, that are compassionate, that are welcoming to talk about it. It's a topic that there tends to be a little bit of closedness about, and we don't think that that should actually be the case. And so we're going to open it up here today, and that is the topic of grief and the topic of loss and death that sometimes open up in our lives and lead us to a sensation of grief. And the role that we have as Reiki practitioners, all of us on this call, but also those in the extended community, to hold a space for grief and to tend to our communities around this really important and incredibly human and very beautiful in certain ways experience. And so that is what we're going to dive into today. Ladies, thank you so much for bringing this topic forward and being willing to jump in.
Cool. Well, I'm going to jump in, Carrie.
Jump in, Bronwen.
Well, because I have recently experienced loss, and my mum died last week. So, it has been at the forefront of my mind as to, what we experience, at times of someone's death, but also that those feelings of grief that we have and what it means and how we work through it and all the different things that we know about grief. And as you said, Michaela, the things that are often not talked about, we don't want to go to, I sometimes it feels to me, and sometimes I do that, that is that, we don't want to touch the grief. We want to stay away from the grief. And it's like, it's like this superficial life that we lead. And yet there seems to me that we've always got grief of some sort. Grief is about loss. And we've lost in our lives. There are so many things we lose, and things that mean things to us very dearly. If I look back as a child, the loss of a dog, the incredible grief around that. Just going through life, I've also lost my father. So now I've lost my mother, and I know other people have lost lots more people than that in their lives. So I have a fairly small family, so there's less that sort of loss, but there's other types of losses too, so whether it be that feeling of loss of control, of being able to do anything about what's happening in our environment around us, so with the climate, what we're losing there. I mean, there's so many different things that we may feel loss about. So it's as if we've got this full sort of like, I don't know, well of loss, and it sits in us. And then when things happen, we have the opportunity to move into that loss and touch on that loss and feel that loss. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's, it's definitely it's as if it's a way of showing our love. So all the love that, I might have and still have for my mum, is expressed in my grief, because it's like these two things are intertwined, and that it doesn't mean that I need to dwell in my grief, but I need to definitely have an open heart And if I have an open heart, then I can touch that grief and I can really experience it and feel it for what it is, you know. So yeah, I think that grief is a great thing. With my mum, it's quite funny in a way, because she's had a lot of strokes, and then she also had dementia, and I sort of feel like I've been through a number of deaths with my mum already. And so it was like she was building my resilience to grief. Yeah, not to say that I can't feel it, but that it's okay, and it's something that, you know, I still obviously, you know, we still go through these levels of experience. I can't think what they are, the different stages of grief. I know someone there will know them, but you know, you still go through those things, but she's made me go through them a number of times, that woman. So I you know, I'm thankful in a sense, because it has made me be able to possibly sit with that open heart with her, with that, feel it and love it rather than hate it. Yeah. And so yeah, I think she's given me sort of more meaning in that, more meaning to understanding of what grief is, what death is, and you know, that deep sense of loss. But before I finish up on that little bit, I just want to say, yeah, and what I started with is that, so we shouldn't just go, oh, we shouldn't have feelings. You know, I think that sometimes people are like, oh, especially, you know, if you're a practitioner. Yeah, so we're practitioners, we're working on ourselves, we're wanting to be these whole, you know, beings, but we are humans. And as a part of being that beautiful whole human being, I think that grief is a part of us. I don't think that, you know, as a human, I think it's a part of our experience, and it's something that we shouldn't detach ourselves from, if you like, and we should allow it to be a part of us and inform us and support us in showing our love for those or those things that we've lost in our life.
Absolutely. Carrie, I want to hear what comes up for you. There's just one piece I want to highlight, Bronwen. You made this really important distinction between resilience. You said that going through this journey with your mom built your resilience to grief, but not resilience and not like apathy or disconnection, right? So it's like, it's not that, oh, the exposure to it made you numb to it. It made you resilient. It made you be able to be present for it. And that's a very different thing. And that's something that the system of Reiki gives us, a capacity to make more space inside, to hold that love and grief, which are dependent on each other. You don't have grief if you haven't loved a thing, right? You don't grieve it if you didn't love it.
Yeah.
So
And I agree. And I think that, you know, when we're working with the system of Reiki, we're working on becoming whole and conscious, you know, so bringing that consciousness up and understanding deep meaning, finding that within ourselves, being able to go deeper into ourselves. So all of those things support us in actually feeling and living with our humanity, which includes grief.
Yeah, so I think what I'd love to touch into about the topic of grief, and I so appreciate all that you're sharing with us, Bronwen, in this really intense moment, and having just let your mom go, like, yeah, just holding a lot of love and light for you. But my experience of grief is that what I have seen in others, so I'm just going to start there and I'll talk a little bit more about my own experience of it, is that a lot of times grief just shuts us down. And especially in the lives of my clients or just friends and people who are close to me, it's unfortunate that I feel like they don't, it seems that to me that most people don't turn to their medicine, you know, in times of grief. And of course, Reiki is my medicine. And so I think of it as just such a profound thing to tune into when we're going through periods of grief. But it's really important, the mindset that we bring to our intentions with Reiki. And I think sometimes within the Reiki community, there can be a little bit of a numbness or a bypassing around uncomfortable emotions. And certainly grief is one of those. And so that, like, just wanting to like kind of shove it away, or, flit it away, and not really go through the process of really deeply feeling and moving out that energy, or that the heaviness that we might feel in a period of grief. And like, there's something so healing about tears and just being willing to cry it out. And like, there's a word within yoga about like that feeling after a good cry is like a rasa, or something that actually brings us more life. And a rasa is something, if like, a plant is dry, you water it, and the plant, like you guys have been saying, is resilient. And so much of the process of being with our grief is to feel it and to allow it to be there, and like you said, transform it back to love. Because I don't know, for myself, I feel like sometimes grief can get lost in anger as well. And I say that, my own personal experience of grief is that, well, I'll actually keep it on others for a moment, but I'll say that when people are very intolerant to feeling death, are very scared of the grief process, or just like really can't emotionally take in the work of grief, it's often a sign that one is incapable of looking at their own death. And that a lot of times grief, as much as it is sad to see somebody very close to us go away, and there's, so many things about that, but also turns us back into our own relationship with death and dying.
Yeah.
And so a long time ago, I created a workshop called Heal Your Death. And it was really fundamentally about this topic, is like, how can we realize, be in the process of realizing that every day we're literally dancing on our own grave. And as crazy as that sounds, that is in some ways our reality. And, to take some inspiration from the Tibetan book of Living and Dying is to be with our sacred self in that moment and that transition to dying. And just like your mom gave you this gift of like, having many different ups and downs with their health over the last few years, I think every time we lose somebody very close to us, it's also important to tune in to our own mortal self, and the fact that someday we will go through that great transition. And that some process of sitting also with the anxiety that we might feel around death liberates ourselves from it, and liberates ourselves from the fear of death. And if you've read the book of Tibetan book of Living and Dying, you'll know that they give you several practices on how to liberate yourself from the fear of death. And one of the things that I think is so relevant to that is that a lot of times that also can help free us up from anxiety, of a life lived in anxiety. Because a lot of times, if you really look at anxiety closely, I found that most of it is rooted in a fear of death. So those are just some thoughts I have about, death and dying, and maybe from my perspective and from some different places, but also from Reiki. And then, life gives us a lot of opportunities to try this really heavy work on, and that's always so unfortunate. And so maybe later, I'd love to hear your perspective, Michaela. And maybe later we can talk about our own experiences of how we've moved through grief in our own life, and practices that feel really supportive of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this topic is one that's been, in my field for quite some time. I've actually been leading a group of practitioners in an ongoing conversation on the topic of grief and loss, and specifically around the roles and responsibilities and joys of Reiki practitioners in holding that space. And, a lot of richness has come out of that. And one of the places that we began, I would say there was three really important themes that came up strongly in the beginning that we've been threading through that I wanted to name here. What the first being, kind of what I started off with, that our culture doesn't give us a lot of space to talk about this. There's a lot, you two have already named, a dynamic of kind of stuffing this down, not talking about it, being afraid to ask people how they're doing, even, when they've been experiencing a loss. And I think, Carrie, you really touched on a big reason of that, of, a fear of our own eventual loss of ourself. And the fact that our culture doesn't really give us a comforting or, resilient perspective on what that means. And there just aren't a lot of spaces to practice holding grief and joy in the same space. And, so when we think about our responsibilities as Reiki practitioners inside of that context, the first thing that comes up is our responsibility to our own practice, our self-practice. It always begins there, so that we can be a space that's big enough to hold grief and joy in the same space, and then to be a space where other people can practice doing the same, that we can, witness them in their process, but also model what it looks like to hold joy and grief in the same space. And I think that part of why we run from grief is that we're afraid of losing touch with joy, but because it can be all consuming, right? We can get swept under the waves of grief and not be able to feel much else. But again, I think that comes back to not having a culture of practice around making room for all of it and understanding that it's all there. But on the other hand, when we are holding a healthy relationship with grief, it's so natural for, laughter and beautiful memories and jokes and, feelings of love and joy to come alongside the reminiscing of what we've lost. And so that's, one of our responsibilities and joys, is that we get to be in a practice of being big enough ourselves, having enough space inside of ourselves to hold all of it, and then to model that for others. From that, one of the other pieces that came forward really strongly is the role as the sacred witness, and being able to create spaces, hold spaces, either formally or informally. Like I've held formal grief rituals, or, things like that come up certainly in sessions or classes, but also informally, just as we're moving through our day and our relationships, being a sacred witness for other people's process, and being able to be with them, have compassion for them and with them, without trying to control their experience, without trying to tell them how they should be feeling about that experience, without being so uncomfortable being around a person who's grieving that we have to try to fix it for them, right? Because that's, often something that happens, is that we don't know what to do in the face of somebody else's grief. We don't know what to do with the memories of our own grief that come up. And so in that discomfort and that inability to manage that discomfort, be resilient inside of that discomfort, oftentimes we either run away from it, can't deal with it, or we might go into the need to try to fix it, right? To do whatever we have to do to make this person feel better as quickly as possible. And neither of those two extremes actually honors or gives space to the grief and the grieving person and the myriad of other feelings that are alongside that grief. And so, I just wanted to really start there, naming this really sacred, very beautiful responsibility and also joy. I think I've used the term in the past, kuleana, which in Hawaiian means joyful burden. And, we could also say joyful responsibility of, having practices that allow us to be with grief, our own and others, in ways that model a healthy relationship with grief as part of our humanity, as you spoke to, Bronwen, as opposed to this unhealthy kind of toxic relationship with grief that we often have, that causes us to behave in ways that aren't healthy for us or others, including addictions and, numbing behaviors and dissociation and, any number of unhealthy responses.
Even meditation.
Say that again.
Yeah. Like even people saying, oh, I'm going to meditate to, go into this meditation space. It's as a way of escaping the actual experience and what they're going through. Yeah. So, I mean, it depends, of course, it depends on the intent of what we're doing in that. But, if we're trying to, we want to be in touch with what we're feeling, isn't it? Rather than, as you just said, the numbing thing. That's what made me think of it. Sometimes I think people think when they go into a meditation space, it's going into maybe a blissful space, or it's a space possibly. I mean, there are all different layers of this, yes, but going into it as a way of hiding. So going into it not to actually experience an open heart.
Yeah, well, there's a way in which, certain orientations towards our spiritual practice can disguise dissociation, can disguise a desire to escape and to numb and, leave the situation, right? And so we might focus on, ascension or, leaving the earth, as opposed to, really rooting down into the body, right? The physical body, the sensations of the body, and being able to tolerate, and to move through what we're actually experiencing instead of trying to escape them. And so, I love that. It's like, and it can look the same from the outside, right? A person meditating could be coming from it from these different perspectives. And so there's a self-responsibility in there. It's like really knowing my own motives and my own feelings. And, there was a certain point in my life when I became able to when I became aware of when I would dissociate and be stepping out of my body, as opposed to that being something that happened outside of my control. And then it was like, okay, well, what do I do about that then? That was a long journey.
And I think sometimes people, especially, Reiki teachers, for example, and practitioners, in general, just that whole thing of like, you're meant to be above feeling. You're not meant to actually be able to, you're not meant to be sad, or to cry. I loved what you said before, Carrie, about crying. That total lovely sense of release, and that if we have that open heart and complete connection with everything, then we are all of these things. And it's how we live with that, though, isn't it? It's how we what we do with that, possibly.
Yeah, I think it speaks to a lot of the dissociation that I feel like sometimes happens within spiritual communities around death, is like, like you were saying, just not an ability to hold sadness as, a truth, as relevant for somebody in the moment, and maybe over a long period of time. It takes time to work through sadness. And unfortunately, I just see so much of discourses within spiritual communities about like, oh, they're in a better place, or kind of passing it around, or like saying, this is, you being too human, or, like, and I'm actually a deep believer in reincarnation. I feel that that's a deep truth for me in my spiritual journey and path, and mirrored in my yoga practice and in Reiki as well. But nevertheless, letting go of this life is a lot. It's like so much work. We come into this life with nothing, and we build everything that we have, and then we go through a journey of letting it all go. It's an incredibly scary process. And when you're in touch with those feelings, it's a great way to bring more consciousness into them, because I think all of us are in some ways in touch with that ultimate reality, yet we can shove it down. And I mean, like, think about the rituals around funerals. It's usually like, I don't know, maybe because I came from like European descent, but it's just like, get drunk as possible at the funeral, which in some way a way of celebration and joy too, but a lot of it is around that just incredible discomfort around being sad, and being sad in a group of people, around a group of people. So I think that that's like unfortunate. And I love what you're saying too, Michaela, about being able to hold space for grief and joy. And I think that that's something that what happens, when we go through a period of loss, like we get the tunnel vision, and the tunnel vision just comes around us, and it's like that loss and the grief is all that we can see. And it is so important to remember that, and to give ourselves, like in the process, to give ourselves permission to return to joy, as a sacred offering for the love that we have for the people we lose. And I know I was really like, I don't know, I really felt this. And it's an interesting contrast to all that we're talking about. But, I had my own moments with some postpartum depression. And and it's kind of ironic, right? Because that's the moment where you're giving life, you're bringing life into the world. And I had a hard time really, recognizing the postpartum depression for what it was for me, and how much it was affecting my psyche, and how I felt about life and the world. But after having my two kids, almost 2 months after having my kids, I was in a car accident. And so like so much of the pain that I was feeling in my body, and just in the task of becoming a new mom and having really young kids, and just how intense that is um, if I can look back on it now, and after like resurfacing from those years, was that what I was experiencing was actually a lot of grief. And it sounds ironic to feel that way, but it was the grief and the amplification of like not only having to worry about my life, but having to worry about my very young, vulnerable kids' lives in a very scary world. And then, having the pain that I felt in my body after the car accident, all of that stuff. It's like, and then it really, sometimes it just keeps compounding and compounding until we deal with it. But something very terrible happened in my life. One of my girlfriends, her son was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And we just like all had to like hold arms together and just walk her through the process of letting her son go. And a 9-month process of it was just absolutely devastating. And my heart still breaks for my friend and her family and all that went on with that. And it's like through that visceral experience, I realized like it's just this fear of death. It's this grief that I'm living even, of things that haven't even happened yet. So, Reiki was so pivotal for me to come back into my center, and to always adjust my perception versus reality, and finally to give me my that emotional intelligence back to say, I'm living grief, somebody else's grief, my own grief, the burden of grief, burden of life. And yet I need to create these spaces, just have joy, to just enjoy my family and my life for what it is right now, to not worry so much about, the inevitable arc of life.
Yeah. We this is so similar to a topic that came up in the Reiki 3 Shambhinan class I taught this weekend. And we were talking about Reiki as a vehicle, as a practice for cultivating joy and for building the capacity to always be able to dip into that reservoir of joy that's inside of us. And we were working with the Book of Joy, and, just really opening up that channel that Reiki, is one of many practices that can give us to being in touch with joy. And one of the things that a student brought up was that that she felt some like automatic associations of guilt with that there's so much suffering in the world. There's so much suffering in her own family. And, shouldn't I be more, I don't know. Is it frivolous for me to be focusing on my own joy and my own happiness?
Yeah.
And I think this is something that comes up a lot around this, and why I always emphasize that grief and joy have to live side by side. Because, if we operate from the perspective that, what right do I have to be joyful or loving or happy when there's so much suffering? And I let myself then just dwell inside of only the suffering, then how in the world am I going to do anything to alleviate that suffering? Right? How can I bring any kind of joy to other people if I myself am denying myself that reservoir. And that, again, back to the responsibility as somebody who has a practice that gives us a specific way of cultivating that sensation of joy, that it's a responsibility to do that, to walk through the world as much as possible in our humanity, as much as possible, representing that full spectrum of humanity, and allowing ourselves to feel that, really claiming it as our birthright to always have access to that whenever we can. And so, if that's something that ever comes up for folks, like, oh, I feel guilty because I was laughing at that funeral. I feel guilty that I'm, having a good, relaxing day when there's these difficult things going on. I just really invite you to let that go, because we need joy. We need more happiness, and it's contagious, right? We give permission to others to feel that joy when we are able to tap into it authentically for ourselves. So I just wanted to name that dynamic.
It's a balance, isn't it? I mean, I agree with you. And yet, there's also that other side that we're talking about, that people will sometimes not want to go there to grief, right? So, and we'll be like, oh no, I'm fine. And I can't think what that was, but there must have been a movie recently where someone kept saying I'm fine, and they're like, well, no, you're not. The more you say you're fine, the more I know you're not fine, right?
But when a person is in that place, when they're actively pushing their grief aside, and they're in that I'm fine place, they actually also aren't able to experience joy or happiness. So it's not like they're choosing joy and happiness over grief, right? They're actually in denial of both, right? And that's that numb space, that dissociated space, where nothing can move in that space.
Yeah. And I find, for myself, because it's sort of fresh at the moment, that I'll start often in the I'm fine space, but it sort of disintegrates.
I felt that. Yeah. When you let us know the news, that was the first thing you said, and I'm fine.
Oh, did I? I'll often start.
And I'm fine. And it's like I believe you, and at the same time, like we're also like there's room. There's room.
Yeah. I know when I was talking to the ladies, like the funeral ladies and that, and I was like da, 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 and then after about 10 minutes, I started going. I thought, oh, you're so funny. But, it's that like trying to control a situation, and not wanting to just be a blubbering mess, obviously, because, communication's a little difficult in that situation. So, just trying to, this is just life, isn't it? And yeah,
absolutely.
I like it.
One of the other things that stood out that reminded me as we were working with the Book of Joy this weekend, I've worked a lot with that material. I've ran a 21-day practice with it a little way ago, and I don't know, it's just a resource I go to over and over and over again. And the second half of the book is breaking down the 8 obstacles to joy and the 8 pillars of joy that Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama have identified. And there's a section on grief as one of the obstacles to joy. And one of the things that really stood out to me, certainly the first time I read the book, but even as I returned to it, is that, in that section, it's all about embracing grief. It's like you would expect it to, it's an obstacle to joy. So you would think it would be about, here's practices and techniques and information for how to, not be grieving, right? How to move the grief aside. But it's all the things that we've been saying. It's the importance of embracing it, acknowledging it, living it, experiencing it, acknowledging it in others, making room for all of the complexity of it, allowing it to bring our compassion forward, allowing it to bring our generosity forward. Very strong correlation between sadness and grief and generosity, right? And so in a certain sense, there's, it's a necessary part of our relating with each other in healthy ways. And it's just really, beautiful to hear these 2 incredible spiritual leaders, talk about the value of their own grief personally and our grief collectively, not as something to shy away from, not as something to shun, but as something to embrace and, work with, and in that way move to the other side of it, right? Not that we want to cling on to it, but how do we actually move through it is by turning towards it and towards each other. And so the practices inside of that section are all about, being with, right? In compasión, to be with pain, our own first and foremost, and then others, right? Which of course is the foundation of our Reiki precepts, to be in compassion for ourselves and for others, to be grateful. Gratitude, such a powerful companion for us when we're in a state of grieving, that allows us to access those feelings of joy and connection, generosity and love at the same time as experiencing our grief. And so these simple practices, these simple reminders that root us back in, really what the point is, which is to experience ourselves as love and to experience each other as love, and to not let anything be in the way of that. And it's like, I don't say that to be like pretty or, trite or, stereotypical. It's like, I mean it in that like raw, love as a verb. Like love is not easy. It's not easy to live our lives as an embodiment of compassion for ourselves and others. Which is why there's, systems of practice all over the world that specifically direct us in how to do that, because it's that important.
Yeah, grief is an expression of our love. Yeah. It's just another way of doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Carrie, you wanted to talk about your experience, I think.
Well, I kind of already did around, having kids, and then, having a close friend go through some challenges. But, more recently, my friend was killed in an act of gun violence in Denver right after Christmas. And so that's been really raw for me too. And then just having it mirrored in so much gun violence in the United States, and this just terrible, awful shooting that happened in Uvalde recently. So, I think it's shocking for me. Also, there's this edge that I feel of just wrongness, and that there is just an incorrect worldview as it relates to, our own self-sovereignty. And so I don't really have a whole lot of words to say about that, except that like I'm outraged, too, and I want to make a positive change for, not only my generation, but my kids. I think sometimes also it is about, I don't know, the violence that we see in the world. I think it's so much about what we're consuming too, in terms of what we're watching. And it's what's so shocking to me is the amount of violence that we see on film every day, and what that does to our brain, to how we're wired towards trauma, towards violence. And so I think some part of this collective grief that I think we're feeling too, that we can feel into. And I had this insight, this feeling, this sensation, this overwhelming truth come to me that something bad was going to happen. And I knew that it was something in the collective. I knew I was okay. But, just a day or two later, this mass shooting happened. And so I think
shootings every day in the US. I'm not.
US,
but I mean, didn't they say there's more shootings per days than there are in the days of the year so far? Like mass shootings. It's big.
It is
disturbing. Yeah, so I don't know. It's that edge of, being the peaceful person, but also engaging peace and engaging acts of nonviolence in our world. And I think that that's also really in my heart right now, is like, how do I really mindfully, go through those really intense emotions around grief, but also like, I had this insight about like the good that can come from people dying. And it's a very humbling thing, but there's a lot of good that can happen. You think about all of the laws that we've made to help protect people happen out of tragedy.
That's right.
And so I think being mindful of like how we can make something that's just an awful blight on humanity and each other, how we can turn it around and make it better.
Well, and that's love as a verb, right? Love as action. And that, one of the devastating impacts, not only for us personally, but collectively, when we turn away from grief, is that we lose that energy towards action, right? If we're apathetic, if we're numb, if we're dissociated, we are not taking action on things that matter. And so when something happens in the collective that brings forward collective grief, and so many people respond with numbness, with turning it away, with changing the channel, with saying, oh, I can't deal with that, that's too far away, there's nothing I can do about that, then nothing happens. And we just sit with that. We just sit with the toxicity of that collective grief that's unprocessed. And so, thinking of what's one small thing that we actually can do, right? And that might look like holding a space for grief in our community, right? I hold these rituals called Ritual Plus Action that are around holding space for grief. And then from that, deciding on small actions that we can take in service of how we feel, right? It might look like any number of things, but something that's achievable, something that feels like it's inside of our capacity, so it's not overwhelming, that addresses that feeling of overwhelm and that this is unacceptable, right? It's unacceptable that our culture produces more mass shootings than days in the year. That is not acceptable. And yet so many of us accept it. And a big part of that is that we don't know how to be uncomfortable, right? We can't be with the discomfort of looking at it. And so we look away. It's understandable that we would look away, but we also have the ability to increase that capacity, that resilience that you started with, Bronwen. And that's, again, part of our responsibility as people who know practices that help us do that, to be a space that help people learn and to choose to take that action.
Yeah, when you keep coming back to that thought of just like love and action, and there's another term that my teacher often uses called savage bliss. And so it's this powerful, deep emotional bliss that's related to loving somebody more than yourself, or to having your heart on your sleeve, to having children, to having parents who just, gave you everything, and then, having to hold their hand, in those moments. And I do want to acknowledge that I think Reiki, within the Reiki community, there are these Reiki goddesses out there. They're beautiful, gorgeous goddesses, but they can hold that power of grief and death and dying. And so there's a lot of Reiki often given, at those moments of death. And I think that that's really relevant and in alignment with that Tibetan book of living and dying that I mentioned, is that, in the Buddhist belief, is like at the end, at that moment of dying, that's that powerful spiritual energy that you bring with you into whatever is next. And so being with and holding those right emotional spaces, obviously at some point in that moment for ourselves, but also like this amazing capacity of some Reiki healers who feel really, capable of sitting with people and holding that powerful energy for them in what is sometimes the hardest moments of our life. So I think that really points also to, obviously the spiritual energy of Reiki, but of that we are supported through life. Like, I love that idea of like a death doula. I think that's just so beautiful, like to have somebody birthing us into this next realm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, Carrie, that you bring up, the idea of deities or, metaphoric symbols like that, whether or not we relate to them as, actual entities or metaphors for, something less tangible than we can really conceive of. However we relate to them, there is a power in the symbology and the imagery and the friendship even that can come when we learn about about different deities. And, one that I learned about from you, Bronwen and Franz, Furomyo in Japanese tradition. And one of the really upfront deities inside of Shingon Buddhism. He's the first deity that is invoked in a death ritual, in a funeral service, because he's there to help strengthen our resolve and strengthen our resilience as we move into that unknown space as we die. And there's an understanding that the human heart and the human mind and spirit does have this fear that you've been speaking to, Carrie, and that fear can get in the way of the journey that we're meant to take after death, and can get in the way of the journey that those who are still living are meant to take in their grief. And so, this deity is invoked in order to strengthen and to burn away that which is in the way of having that strength and resilience. And, I started learning about that right at the beginning of 2020, and, working with this energy, and it just really made sense to me during that time, right? There's so much collective grief as that time began and progressed, and that we're still carrying and working through. And so, yeah, I've just kind of developed this friendship with Furomyo at that time, and that's still become important. And so much so that I did end up tattooing him on my arm. So he's right there. And so he's here because he's right at my heart, so I can hold them right here. And for me, it was I felt a little bit okay, I'm signing up to be, another white woman with a Japanese deity tattooed on my arm. That's going to possibly bring, questions or judgment. And that's okay, because I actually I need it here. I'm in relationship with this energy, this metaphoric energy, if you will, in a way that really matters, and that has really been supportive of me during this time. And so I just I need it right here. It's just, I don't know, I hadn't talked about that before, and you just about it, Carrie.
It's beautiful. Ritual in so many ways is a part of grief, isn't it? And
absolutely,
yeah, just helping us move through, and the things that we do, whether we tattoo things on ourselves.
That's always been part of my process. There's quite a few of them.
Tattoo.
What's that? What did you say, Carrie?
Oh, I said somebody just died. I need a new tattoo. It's my processing.
That's like my child has just tattooed their dog that died on their arm. Right.
My daughter is doing the same. She just lost her dog. She's got an appointment ready for that. So it's, that ritual of commemoration, that ritual of I want some piece of this love, right, with me, whether that's a tattoo or anything else. It's important. And I think that perhaps maybe that's the note for us to close on as we come to the end of our time, is that, for those listening, for us here, what are the ritual components? Could be very, very simple. What are the tangible actions that help us to be with our grief? Whether that's getting a tattoo, whether that's sitting down with a friend and laughing, whether that's looking at pictures, letting people know that it's okay to ask us about our loved ones, because they might not feel comfortable, asking us, and think they're causing us to feel more sad when we really just would rather talk about it, whatever that thing is that helps you to stay grounded, to stay in your body, to let the feelings move through your body, whatever it is that feels nourishing and supportive, I encourage you to explore that, and to reach out, for help, whether that's to friends or to practitioners, to professionals who can support you in various ways, which may include Reiki practitioners. Those of us who have spent time building the ability to be sacred witness for that time, we are definitely here to hold that space. And we'd love to hear from you about what grief has meant to you in your life, what has helped you to move through it, and what you would want to offer for others when they're in their time of grieving. So friends, thank you so much for another incredibly rich conversation. This has just become such a special time for me. And I know it has for the two of you as well, to just get to come together and talk about whatever is at the top of our heart in a given week. It's a really special thing to get to do with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing it with me too. I love it.
Absolutely. All right, friends, until next episode, we hope you are deeply provisioned and taking care of yourselves. We love you. Bye-bye.